Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Missable Macbeth Moments, Unbecoming. In this series, I like to take small moments from across the play and discuss what they could mean and their wider significance. In this episode, I'd like to think about how the roles of Lady Macbeth and Macbeth are reversed across the play. Lady Macbeth starts off being the dominant member of the couple in Act 1. She gives instructions, she tells him off or chastises him when he fails to meet her expectations. And then there is a shift. In Act 2, and then even more so in Act 3, Macbeth starts to become more autonomous and makes decisions for himself, ultimately leading to him defying her wishes and killing Banquo and Lady Macduff's family. He takes on her traits of being bloodthirsty and ambitious, whereas she seems quite content with being queen. In this scene, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have just arrived home from Scone Palace, where they've been crowned king and queen, and they are welcoming Banquo to court. In Act 3, Scene 1, there is an exchange of dialogue between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth and Banquo. Macbeth greets Banquo and says, "Here's our chief guest." And then Lady Macbeth says, "If he had been forgotten, it had been as a gap in our great feast, and all thing unbecoming." Lady Macbeth says that if Banquo wasn't going to be there, and that if there was going to be a gap in our great feast, then this would be unbecoming, which means incorrect, or even inappropriate or indecent. This foreshadows what occurs in Act 3, Scene 4, in the banquet scene, when Banquo is absent from the feast due to his murder in the previous scene, and this causes Macbeth great perturbation and distress, and Macbeth does find it indecent. Lady Macbeth realises how inappropriate it would be for Banquo not to be there, and she is being sincere in this scene. But the audience soon understand by the end of this scene that Macbeth is being disingenuous and that he is hiring murderers to kill Banquo and his son Fleance. So we have Lady Macbeth now acting as the more moral character, whereas she was more immoral in the previous acts. This scene exacerbates this void that's now developed between the couple, and it shows us that Lady Macbeth would never have advised Macbeth to kill Banquo, and that her opinion and her desires are irrelevant now. There's been a shift in power. The strength of their relationship is crumbling, and there are now more secrets being kept between them. This seems to begin in Act 2, Scene 3, where Macbeth kills the guards who were guarding Duncan without consulting Lady Macbeth, and this of course was never part of her original plan. Linking to wider themes, the main theme we can discuss is deception. Both Macbeth and Banquo act duplicitously in this scene. It's a very interesting scene in three main sections. In the first section of the scene, Banquo gives a monologue to the audience about how he distrusts Macbeth and how he thinks he played foully to get the crown. In the second section, we have the dialogue between Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, and Banquo. And in the final section of the scene, we have Macbeth talking to the murderers, convincing them to kill Banquo. In Banquo's monologue at the start, he says how he thinks that Macbeth played most foully to get the crown, and so we as an audience already know his true feelings about Macbeth. But when Macbeth asks him if he's going to be riding out that afternoon with Fleance, there is a subtext here. Macbeth could be asking him if he's still loyal, and if he's planning on leaving the castle later that day for good, much like Macduff has already defected. To his face, Banquo tells Macbeth that their relationship is strong and that there is a most indissoluble tie forever knit. But the audience knows this is not the truth. Later, Macbeth acts courteously to Banquo's face in return. But then, of course, in the final section, we learn that he hired the murderers yesterday, and he asks them to kill Banquo and his son Fleance that very night. There is a quote where he says to the murderers, "Was it not yesterday we spoke together?" which shows us that he's been planning Banquo's murder for at least a day, probably longer, and it isn't something that he decides upon after speaking with Banquo in this scene. It also shows us that he has no intention of consulting Lady Macbeth or waiting to see if Banquo is loyal or not. His mind was made up. So the second person being two-faced here, or duplicitous, is Macbeth. One final point here on deception, he is also deceiving Lady Macbeth to an extent, through the method of equivocation, which I talk about in one of my other videos. This is where you omit details and you leave things out. So it's not lying through telling a lie, it's lying through not telling someone something and leaving certain details out. And of course, the next scene, 3.2, is where he says to her, "Be innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck." She says to him, "You must leave this." She's consulting with him and telling him to stop the murders, stop being bloodthirsty, and I think that he leaves it so long to discuss it with her because he knows that she would counsel him not to do this. Finally, we can link to the theme of power. Lady Macbeth has lost her power over Macbeth by this point in the play, and her previous methods of manipulation are failing her. Macbeth's hubris is growing, and his megalomania is developing out of control, which is a typical trait of a tragic hero. This act, Act 3, being the centrepiece of the play, really shows us Macbeth's characterisation developing and how he is changing from the more feeble and more downtrodden character from Act 1, who is easily manipulated, to the true kind of villain and anti-hero of this story. Thanks for watching this video, and if you are interested in this type of discussion and this type of analysis, please do check out my other videos on the channel. Have a great day. Thank you again.